Please welcome Staffing Program Manager, Google, Kerry Cathcart.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am Kerry Cathcart, and I have worked at Google now for about 14 years. I actually started out supporting customers of our ad products, but since then have worked in sales marketing, in customer support strategy, HR shared services. I've implemented a few of our HR systems, but for the last 2.5 years, I've been leading a team at Google called Offer Review. And it's a fairly unique team. We actually govern the tail end of our hiring process, how we make our hiring decisions. And so what our job is really to make sure we're making the highest quality hiring decisions and doing it fairly and consistently. And so what I'm here to talk to you a little bit about today is how we hire at Google. Because when you look at all of your people processes, how you hire is the most important thing you do. If you invest in the right people up front, you're going to be investing a lot less in managing low performers, backfilling attrition, and just overall the quality of the work is going to be higher. Now, some people think that hiring is an art, that some people are just good at it and some people aren't. We have over 1 million people apply at Google every year, and so we can't just trust that people are good at it. And for smaller companies, even a couple of misses can really impact your organization. And hiring is hard. Show of hands, how many of you have ever made a hiring mistake in your career? I have. And at Google, we're really lucky. We have really high volumes of hiring, and we have the resources available to invest in research and innovation in this space. And so that's allowed us to experiment and to use data analysis to really take a more scientific approach to hiring. And we know not other companies have our scale or have the luxury of some of our resources. And so that's why we like to come and tell you what we've learned. And as we take on new research or we start looking at new experiments, and not just in hiring, but across all of our people operations, we're focusing on what we call the 4 E's. We want to ensure the process is as efficient as possible. We want to make sure the process is effective. So in hiring, we're hiring the right people. And we want to focus on a great user experience. So that's the candidates in this case. And then lastly, we want the process to be equitable. And that's a huge focus of my team, making sure the decisions we make are fair, they're unbiased, and they're consistent. And so let's take a look at our hiring process at a really high level. Most of this is going to be fairly standard. Somebody applies to a job, it's screened, and if they meet the qualifications, they're taken to a phone screen. If a candidate does well at a phone screen, we'll invite them on site for interviews. But it's after that interview process where things get a little more unique at Google. There's no hiring manager that makes a hiring decision alone. We actually hire by committee. And so today what I'm going to take you through is more detail around that interviewing stage and that hiring committee stage. When we interview, we're assessing across 4 key attributes that we think are core to what makes a Googler successful. So for your companies, those attributes might look different. You might even have attributes that vary for different roles or parts of your organization. But these are core to our assessment. The first attribute, and this is the one that's really applicable to every company, is role-related knowledge. Do you have the basic skills to do the job on day one? Now, how you assess for role-related knowledge is going to vary based on the type of role you're hiring for, the level you're interviewing for. An entry-level salesperson, for example, they're probably going to learn a lot of what they're going to do on the job. So you might be assessing for raw communication skills or influencing skills. However, for a software engineer, their ability to code is critical on day one, and so we're assessing for that. A senior ad executive, they might need to come to the table knowing how to manage C-level relationships and knowing how to deal with really difficult clients. But maybe they don't need to know your specific product suite on that first day. So the trick here is really looking at what are all of the skills that a candidate needs to be successful in the role, and then digging into what they need to walk in the door with and what you're willing to teach them. The next attribute here is general cognitive ability. It is a mouthful. We call it GCA for short. This is about how well a candidate can solve complex problems in your workplace. Likely, most of all of your days involve some kind of problem solving. You're identifying problems, you're figuring out root causes, you're thinking about solutions. And so you want to see how well your candidate can do this. How do they know their solutions are successful? How well do they learn from mistakes? What this isn't are brain teasers or MBA case studies. Our goal is not to trick a candidate or to give a benefit to a candidate who has had the privilege of learning how to break down a case. And we've found that those are not predictive of behavior, of performance on the job. Instead, we want to talk about real problems somebody has solved and how they've done that. And we want to understand how they think they'd approach problems they'll face in our workplace. Honestly, often I'm asking candidates how they would solve problems I'm currently facing. And if they can solve my problems in an interview, that's great for both of us. Now, leadership. And I want to call out that this is very specifically not called people management. Because as we all know, you can be a great leader without having to manage. Now, for people management roles, this is the attribute we use to assess your ability to lead a team, to inspire a team, to drive a strategy. But this is an attribute we're assessing all candidates against, regardless of level or role. And what we're looking for here is someone who's going to take ownership of their work and any issues that come up, who can help influence change. If they have an idea, they can rally their peers around it. And if they see a problem, they'll speak up. Lastly, we have googliness. What is or is not googly is something that gets tossed around a lot on our campuses. It's most often used to describe what people think is good or bad behavior from their coworkers. For example, it is very ungoogly to steal the last of the good snacks from the kitchen. But really, googliness is what we think encompasses what makes Google's culture unique and innovative. And while any Googler you talk to will give you a different definition of what googly means to them, when it comes to hiring, we have to be very concrete about what are the characteristics that we're talking about here. Because this is where unconscious bias can easily seep into your interview process. This is where you get interviewers saying they weren't a culture fit, but they can't really explain why. The test here shouldn't be, do I want to grab a drink with this person after work? That's how you hire more people like you. The test here is, do they have the attributes necessary to do the job? And so what we're looking for here are behaviors. If you see something unethical, are you willing to say something? Do you seek out feedback to improve? If you're handed an ambiguous problem, do you drive it forward or do you wait to be told what to do? Are you willing to challenge the way things have always been? So a couple years ago, I actually hired a junior candidate onto my team who was relocating from the Southeast over to the very pricey Bay Area. And they realized when they got their offer package that they wouldn't actually get paid their relocation bonus until they had already fronted those relocation costs, moved over to the Bay Area, and started at Google. When they found that out, they gave me a call. And they gave me a call not to say, hey, I need an exception for this. They called to tell me very diplomatically about the impact this could have on all of our other candidates and on Google. About how a candidate coming from a lower paying sector or from a lower cost of living area might not be able to afford to relocate and work for Google. Our process was assuming that every candidate had the privilege of a savings account or a family who could support them. And luckily, we were in the process of fixing that issue, but it was that call that cemented we were making the right decision. This is a great fit for Google. This was a candidate who, before even having signed an offer letter, had identified a gap in our processes, took a risk to tell me about it, and did it for the future candidates coming to Google and to make Google better. That's the kind of person we want to hire. So think about what are those qualities you're looking for in your organization and in your employees. And once you've figured that out, the next step is going to be building that into your process in a really structured way. And what I mean by structure here is using structured interviewing. Structured interviewing is a pretty basic concept. It's just taking your interview process and putting it into a much more standard and consistent format. And it will increase how effective, how equitable, and efficient your process is. So you got 3 of your 4 E's. And a great side effect is it makes candidates happier. So you get experience as well. As many of you do, we reject more people that we interview than we hire. And we survey those candidates after they finish the hiring process. And what we found was that when we introduced structured interviewing, the experience of those candidates who didn't get a job increased by 35 points. And a lot of the candidates we're going to hire at Google in the future likely have interviewed with us at some point in the past. And so having them willing to go through that process again is really critical. And so how do we create structured interviewing? There's 3 main components: creating high-quality questions, developing standard scoring rubrics, and by training and calibrating your interviewers. And I'll take you through each of these a little bit. So let's start with interview questions. For structured interviewing, the key is using questions that have been validated against the role requirements. And the second is using the same questions consistently across all of your candidates. Now, believe me, it can be hard to convince the smartest engineer in their field that instead of going and devising the toughest, hardest, trickiest brain teaser they ever could think of, that they should use questions that you've developed for them. But what we found helped get interviewers on board was a delivery mechanism that made it faster and easier for them to use structured questions than to try to devise and prep their own. And so what that looked like for us was for our big roles, the ones we hired a lot of, we had a simple web tool where if you plugged in a role and a level, it spit out a list of questions. But for smaller teams like mine, we just have a shared Google Doc. There's 4 or 5 questions for every attribute. And the day before an interview, my recruiter will send the folks on the interview panel that guide assigned to what attributes each interviewer will assess. Prepping for an interview takes 10 minutes. And within interviews, there are 2 kinds of questions we ask. And we ask these because they have shown to be predictive of performance. And that's behavioral and hypothetical questions. Behavioral questions will ask your candidate to describe experiences they've had that match what they're going to be expected to do in the role. So for example, tell me about a time you had to influence your team to make a difficult decision. Or tell me about your most successful client pitch. You can then dig into other attributes or specific behaviors you're looking for using planned follow-up questions. What steps did you take to understand the request? What resources did you use? If you could do it all over again, what would you do differently? And hypothetical questions are assessing how the candidate would approach problems they realistically might face in your workplace. So imagine that you receive feedback from a partner that one of your team members is underperforming. How do you respond? Or imagine you have to take on a new account and it's known that the relationship with that client is strained. What do you do? And again, you drill in with those follow-up questions. What information do you gather? What does your kickoff meeting look like? You discover your client's expectations are unrealistic. How do you manage them? So once you're ready to ask the right questions, you have to think about how you're going to assess your candidate's answers to those questions. And what we do is we structure interview assessments using standardized rubrics, which is really just a fancy way of saying a grading scale. Rubrics help you ensure you're consistently assessing all of your candidates against the same consistent expectations. And research shows that if you create a good scoring rubric, not only does it decrease bias in your process, it also better predicts performance on the job, so you're going to have higher quality hires. And when you build out rubrics, you're taking those role-related behaviors and skills that you've determined are necessary for success, and then you're defining what a poor, mixed, or good answer to questions about those areas would be. So let's take an example here. Let's say we're interviewing someone for project management skills. And so I can look at those rubric descriptions, I can align the answers I heard in my interviews, and make sure and determine what rating we're going to use. So for a junior hire, for example, if their answer demonstrated that they had trouble prioritizing their work and their project, that might be a poor rating. Now, if a different candidate responded and showed that they could both prioritize their own work and the work of other people in the project team, that might be a strong rating. And as you change levels, so let's look at a more senior person coming into this project management role, those rubric descriptions will change. A solid, strong answer for a senior person might be looking for them to demonstrate they can prioritize a portfolio of projects, or they can prioritize across organizations. Objectivity and consistency here are the key. You stop comparing candidates to each other, and you start comparing all of them to your ideal. And it helps you avoid that trap of jumping on that first decent candidate you see because you've had a bad run of bad interviews. Now, along with those ratings, rubric ratings, and with a general hire and no hire recommendation, we're also asking interviewers to write up fairly detailed interview feedback. We have interviewers not just write up what they thought about the answers, but actually take notes of the specific answers the candidate gave. And then after the interview, we ask the interviewers to read their notes, look at those rubrics, make their rubric ratings, and then write up a summary of how they felt that candidate did against an attribute. So, for example, if we're assessing a candidate's ability to get things done, you might say, the candidate demonstrated that they excelled at getting things done when they talked me through an example of how they led a company-wide initiative. They asked the right questions, they engaged difficult stakeholders early, so on and so forth. You get the idea. This ensures that the interviewers are really thinking about the responses and how they align with the rubrics, and they're not just saying how they felt about an answer, how they felt about a candidate. It also allows our hiring committees to independently review and assess those ratings. And while we provide a lot of structure for our interviewers to make things easier and more objective, there's still a base of information and experience that they need to be successful. And so we expect that all interviewers go through interview training before they start, and we also provide opportunities to shadow experienced interviewers and for experienced interviewers to watch and shadow them when they start interviewing. And once they're out there, you want to make sure they're still getting better. And so we provide a lot of feedback to our interviewers. Our hiring committees are providing feedback. We have Googlers who've created interviewing workshops where they practice interviewing and giving feedback. And we're experimenting with other kind of real-time peer-to-peer feedback mechanisms. We also have candidates give feedback on their interviewers. Our research tells us that interviewers have the most influence on candidate experience. And so in that survey that we give to candidates after they finished our hiring process, we ask them for feedback on the folks that interviewed them. We aggregate that, anonymize it, and we send that feedback to the interviewers. And I know I've been talking for 20 minutes about a lot of things. It's a big time investment. This is a lot. But this is really what's building the future of our company, and this is how you're building the future of your company. And so this isn't the area where we want to shortchange. This is where we're willing to invest. Now, I've mentioned hiring committees a couple times. This is really the bread and butter of my team. This is where we're starting to make the decisions. And in order to ensure we're making the most objective and unbiased decisions, we're ensuring that no single Googler is making the call. And we're making sure that the folks involved in the hiring committees are not directly related or connected to the candidate. They have not referred the candidate, they have not interviewed the candidate's not going to be working on their team. And we use these hiring committees because collectively we make better decisions. We challenge each other on our biases. We challenge each other to make sure that we're hiring someone who's not just able to do that job today, but who is going to be a benefit to Google in the long term. And it also mitigates that bias of the hiring manager who's just desperate to fill ahead, or who's leaning towards hiring a team that just looks more and more like them. And a side benefit, it also helps make sure you're hiring consistently when you're hiring maybe across departments or across offices. And hiring by committee at our scale can take a lot of resources. But this is a practice we've actually seen Googlers take and implement at other companies in our industry. And we've really doubled down on this in the last couple of years. We've made sure all of our hiring committee members have taken unconscious bias training. We've built out extensive trainings around how to evaluate candidates fairly and consistently. We've created trainings around how do you make group decisions, because you look at those differently than you do individual decisions. And then we have my team in place, and we partner with senior leaders across Google who actually do quality checks on the hiring committee outcomes, and we provide them feedback so they can continue to improve. But for smaller companies, hiring committee is a much easier practice to implement. And some of the side benefits we've seen, it really helps keep your leaders aware of hiring trends or organizational shifts. It's a great way to expose future leaders to other people in the company. And it's a really great top-down demonstration to your employees that hiring is part of everybody's job, not just the recruiters. So I'm going to close out talking a little bit about candidate experience. Candidates who have had a positive experience in our hiring process were 28% more likely to accept an offer than those who had an unfavorable experience. And if they had a competing offer with another company, that actually helped. It increased that chance to 44%. And studies show that 83% of job candidates will talk about their experience with their friends and family. And the worse the experience was, the more people they're going to talk to, and they love social media. And so what are the levers you can pull here to make sure you're improving experience? There are 3 things that research shows is the most impactful. The duration of the process, so how quickly you're getting that offer to your candidate knowing what to expect and how to prepare for the interview, and as we talked about, the actual interview experience itself. And anecdotally, what we've seen is that it's also really beneficial that the candidate understands concretely the impact they can have on your company, and they love engaging with leaders. And with a company as big as Google, those 2 things are really hard to scale. But at smaller companies, really showing concretely, this is what you're going to be able to do for us, and having leaders involved in the process, that's really doable, and it really can swing candidates in your favor. So how do you measure candidate experience? As I mentioned, we survey our candidates after their process terminates. And in 2016, we found that 80% of the candidates that we did not offer a job to said their experience was positive and would recommend working at Google to a friend. And that's really just a testament to this process. And this candidate experience survey is actually one of the tools we have available to any of you. You could implement it tomorrow on our rework site. You can see the URL for our rework site here. Alongside the survey, there are a ton of guides that walk you through everything that I've talked about today. So I highly recommend checking it out. So that is everything I have prepared for you today. Hopefully it was helpful. I wanted to leave some time for questions and answers. So if you do have questions, there are 3 microphones set up around the room, so feel free. Thank you. Yep.
Are you seeing a trend in sort of your need to hire young people, so the skills that are developing
So the question is, are we seeing a trend in needing to hire younger due to some of the skills that are needed, mobile skills, and so maybe some of the newer things coming on? We very specifically are not trying to identify age groups or demographics. What we're looking for, and especially in a time where I think, coming back and going back for new education is so positive or is happening more now, what we're really looking for is, do they meet the attributes and the expectations of the role? And so what we don't want to say is, I assume that this person is young and therefore they're going to have the pulse on the young people, because that's not going to be true of every young person. And there actually might be somebody older who has those skills and actually has different experiences they can bring to the table. And so that isn't something that we look for, and we very specifically try to move away from that. And that's where structured interviewing helps prevent teams from saying, I'm only going to pick the 20 to 25-year-olds. Look at the center here.
Yeah, so you talked a lot about the interview process once kind of people come in. Anything that you can share about the phone screens as well, just so we can understand a little bit about what you're looking for there and how you conduct those?
Sure. So in the phone screens, they're typically on the shorter side. It'll be just a single interview, maybe a half an hour, and it really varies by role or by group. But often what you're trying to do there is get a bit of a sense of the GCA, the general cognitive ability, and some of that googliness. And so it's really about getting to know them, making sure they understand the role, and just assessing top level, does it seem like they could be a fit? It's really trying to get rid of, pull out of the process that people they just really are very obviously not a good fit for the role, or maybe not a good fit for the company. So it's pretty high level. Yes?
Hi, did I hear you right in saying on the interview committee, you don't have any members of the team on that committee? How does that work?
Yes, that is correct. So the hiring committee is typically made up of people who understand the role. So for example, for software engineers, our software engineering committees are made up of other software engineers, but they won't be people who are specifically with that group or who are hiring into that team. It might be somebody related to that team, but that hiring manager will not, even if they were in that hiring committee, they would recuse themselves from that decision.
I have kind of two related questions. One, are you seeing an increase in counteroffers? And two, what do you do when you face counteroffers? And in this unemployment rate, especially where I'm from, very, very low unemployment rate, and we are seeing a lot of counteroffers.
Yes, yes, we have seen an increase in counteroffers. It is an extremely competitive environment, especially on the engineering and tech side of the house, and so as we see those, we've been digging in a lot with those candidates to really understand what's driving their choices when it comes to those competing offers. And so at the end there, where I talked about how anecdotally some of the things that we find helps, it's the engaging with leaders, the speed of the process. Trying to remember the other thing I had said. Understanding the concrete impact. And so those are the things that we're starting to find more anecdotally as we talk to candidates are really helping in our company. Over here.
Could you talk a little bit about the scoring metrics that you use? Is it pass, fail, letter grade, and how you bring that together to make a decision?
Sure. So our rubrics are along, I think it's a scale of 4, where it's poor, solid, strong. Don't quote me here. But it's just a 4 range, and they're just words. On our hiring recommendation, our hiring recommendation is a 5-point scale that goes from strong no hire to strong hire. And so typically what a hiring committee is doing is they're looking at a combination of those and kind of weighing it holistically across all of the interviewers and the hiring recommendations. Over here.
How are you dealing with platforms like Glassdoor, and do you find that candidates come to your interviews already knowing what to expect?
Yes.
Too much?
So sites like Glassdoor have definitely changed how we handle structured interviewing. So you can't, especially for a company as public as us, use the exact same questions for every single candidate for 2 years. And so as we do find that some of our questions have leaked onto those sites, we will adjust and adapt. And so we have a list of, hey, these are the ones that are out there. So we're continually evolving that question set. Right in the center.
By not having the hiring manager participate on the hiring committee, I would have thought that you would add a lot of bias into the process because you're assessing basically the ability of the interviewers on how to write their evaluations and not maybe the abilities of the candidates themselves. Isn't there a disconnection there?
So the hiring manager definitely so not all of our candidates will have a specific hiring manager where we might do more pooled hiring, like in our software engineering space. But places where we do have a hiring manager, they're typically very involved in the interview process. And the interviewers might be people on the team. We definitely always make sure there's an independent interviewer, but these are interviewers that really understand the role and understand what that candidate is interviewing for. And sometimes will be the hiring manager themselves. And so really, in order for them to move forward, the hiring manager, is going to be supportive of that. But it's the hiring committee who's saying, is this actually the right call? Is this really the right fit?
How is the hiring committee more capable of taking that decision without meeting the candidate? That's what's maybe hard for me to get.
The goal here is that we want an objective third party because they're the ones who are seeing the full package. They're seeing everything we have on the candidate and have no bias towards, I really need to fill this seat, or this person looks just like me and so I know they'll be great. They're taking that objective, looking at, hey, what's good for our organization, what's good for Google. I mean, there's definitely going to be inherent flaws in any way, but what we've found is this is really successful for us.
Hey, how many average hours of interviews per each hired candidate, and how does that differ between different roles and seniority levels?
Are you saying how many hours of interviewers does a candidate go through?
Yeah, like how many interviews per candidate?
Okay. So we have a pretty strict standard where we don't want to interview any candidate more than 5 times. For a majority of candidates, it will be 4. For some candidates, we'll see 5 interviews. And those will range between half hour to 45 minutes each. Not including a phone screen that might have happened before. But we've done research that proves that adding that 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th interview doesn't actually change how predictive the group is. And so we ask for people to request exceptions and look for good reasons why if we need more than that.
Is that with the same interviewer group, each of those 5 times, or are those different groups?
We interview individually, so it'll be 4 or 5 different individuals that they talk to.
Got it.
I remember hearing that your college GPA was a big part of Google's hiring decision. Is that still a big part of your process? And I'm sure through your acquisitions, you've gotten a lot of people who maybe didn't do so well in college. And any research on how they fared in your culture?
Yeah. So we have done research on that, and what we found is that GPA is not predictive of job performance for people who have been in the workplace for a long time. So we no longer ask for GPA for a majority of candidates. We still do ask for it for new grads because we just have less signal because they haven't been out in the workplace. But it's just one signal that we use. And so if somebody has a bad GPA, it doesn't mean you're not going to get hired at Google. It means we're going to be looking for other evidence that shows how smart you are. And if we see a theme of, hey, maybe this person doesn't have the GCA we're looking for, we might not hire. But it's one small signal amongst a bigger set.
Hi, thanks for sharing your presentation. It was very useful. I'm from a smaller creative agency and a digital agency in India. So my question was, has this been successfully applied at creative agencies where, there's a lot more focus on like cultural fit and interest, in terms of personalities? This looks very structured and, how does it apply in smaller companies like 50 to 100 member teams?
So I don't have any examples of where it's been applied to agencies or smaller companies, but a lot of what we've put in place here are things that are pretty known, not just at Google, not things we research, but external literature and research that we've done. And a lot of it are things that you could do really scrappily. And so I think it's just a question of where can you invest your time? What do you think are the things you'll get the biggest bang from your buck for? Yeah. Yep. So the question is, if somebody scores really well in the rubrics and in the ratings, do they get a higher salary? How does that kind of tie together? So our rubrics, I kind of talked about how rubrics can change based on level, and so our rubrics are really customized to test for not just are you a role fit, but what level you should be. And so what you'll see is performance in interviews might dictate, hey, if you are killing it, in this range of levels, you might be leveled higher. And then it's the level that dictates salary. So, everyone doing the same role at the same level will be coming in around the same salary range. Sorry?
How big is your usual interview group and your hiring group?
Okay. So the question was, how big is our usual interviewing group and hiring committee? So our interview panels are typically 4 or 5 individuals, and we don't do group interviewing. Those are individuals. Occasionally, for some roles, there might be a presentation to a group, for say a UX role. And then our hiring committees right now there's a pretty wide range. Some start as small as 2, some go as large as 12. And the reason for that is because we have not yet done the research and experimented to find out what the ideal number is, but that's on our roadmap.
How are you guys using prestige of education in your hiring process? Someone who went to community school or community college versus Ivy League schools or even college dropouts?
Great. So the question was, how do we use prestige of school? Historically, there was urban legend that we used it a lot. I will not verify that or not, but we really don't look at it today. We're not looking at prestige. We have many roles that we're hiring people without degrees at all. And a lot of this was the introduction of a lot of the structured interviewing. What we're looking for is how a candidate is demonstrating their abilities in the interview. And that those interview signals really are the strongest signal that we're using.
So you showed us metrics for hiring people. When you do a bad hire, do you do any metrics there and compare them with the metrics you did before on that candidate?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
You talked about metrics, using metrics when you hire people. If you do make a bad hire, do you do any metrics there and then compare it to the metric that you made when you hired that person?
We definitely do. What we do more of is we'll look at places where we took risks and said, hey, let's bank on, I think this person will do well, and look at those groups of people and see how they're performing and use that to kind of tweak how we're thinking about things. We definitely have talked through, do we want to go look at things like people who attrit out of Google really quickly, or maybe who didn't perform well right away, but we haven't really dug a lot into those analyses yet. The question was, how long does it take to hire? How long do we forecast to hire? There isn't actually a good answer to that. It really varies by role. So, there are roles where if there is a lot of supply in the marketplace, it might be really quick. If it's super competitive or a really specialized role, a very specific expert of engineer, that could take months. We just hired a person for our team. It took 6 weeks. So unfortunately, there is no perfect answer for that.
Do you do any kind of trial-based component of an interview where you have them do something that's like actual task, like they would be doing on the job, and kind of grade based on that?
We do, and we especially actually do this on our software engineering side. So for our new grads on software engineering, we actually do tests, coding tests, as our initial stage, to see who qualifies to come in for on-site interviews. There are other places where we'll do things that are a little less formal. So for example, for roles in communications, we might have people do a writing sample. And really the trick with any of those kinds of assessments is just like with your interviews, you can't just say, I'm going to read a writing sample and say, seems good. You need to, again, create those rubrics, create that structure to say, how are we scoring these so that we're scoring every candidate against the same expectations consistently. Anything else? Great. Thank you guys so much for your time.